Well, in first century Judaism, Gehenna was understood primarily as a place of purifying and restorative judgment for sinners, and this is well documented in ancient Jewish thought. There were two major schools of thought in ancient Judaism. These were Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, whose founders, Hillel and Shammai, were contemporaries of Jesus, although they were quite old when he was born. Paul actually said that he studied under Hillel's grandson Gamaliel. That's in Acts 22:3. And the views of these two schools of Jewish thought are recorded in a tract in the Talmud called Tractate Rosh Hashanah. And what's interesting is that they quote Zechariah 13:9, which speaks of God's judgment as the refiner's fire, as scriptural evidence that God's judgment of sinners serves to purify and to restore and to prepare for eternal life, rather than to just torture them for all eternity. In the same way that the refiner's fire burns away ore and reveals the pure jewel, so God's refining fire burns away sin and restores the sinner. For a more modern analogy, there's one modern Orthodox Jewish group uses the example of the washing machine. If you put dirty socks in the washing machine, they'll be thrown around in intense heat and kind of bundled about, and it's a kind of traumatic and unpleasant experience, but they come out at the end of the cycle as clean and restored and fit for their owner. So this kind of, and Malachi actually uses in chapter 2 of Malachi, it uses the analogy of the fuller's soap, which is very similar. So this refiner's fire concept is very prominent in the Hebrew scriptures. You find that, as I mentioned in Zechariah, but also in Isaiah, chapter 1, verses 24 to 25, in Malachi, chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, in Proverbs 17:3. I should also say, for balance, that the same tract in the Talmud I mentioned, Tractate Rosh Hashanah, you do find also the concept of what's called annihilationism or conditional mortality. However, this applies only to some very specific categories of the absolute kind of worst sinners. So these two understandings, Gehenna as a place of kind of restorative judgment, and in extreme cases as a place where you might fit within a more conditional mortality framework, these actually sat side by side in ancient Jewish thought. The particulars varied within different schools. So Gehenna, it wasn't something that was exactly defined, but what we can talk about is more prominent themes from less prominent themes. So Gehenna was understood primarily as a place of purifying, restorative judgment because of this kind of refiner's fire analogy. There's a moderate but less prominent thread of this kind of conditional mortality idea, but what you absolutely do not find is any real evidence that Gehenna was understood as a place of eternal conscious torment from the damned. That is a much later theological development that comes about in the kind of early Dark Ages. It wasn't part of the ancient Judean worldview, and also wasn't part of the ancient Greek Christian worldview in the first few centuries after the Calvary.